Right, it is 11 o'clock, so we'll get going. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's final session in the November series in collaboration with CDS. My name is Danielle. Welcome. For those of you who attended last week's session, we talked about National Rail and we talked about HS2, and there'll be some overlapping themes in this one. But for today, we are going to be focusing on of course, the London Underground and London rail infrastructure and how that impacts properties. Just a bit of housekeeping as always. We will have a recording and a copy of the slides available after the webinar, so please do get in touch if you would like a copy of either. There is going to be a quick feedback survey at the very end. We'd really appreciate it if you could take a few seconds to provide feedback. We really find that helpful. And we shall get going and see where we are. So this is our agenda for today. We're going to look at the London Underground as a whole. We're going to touch on Crossrail and the impacts of these types of infrastructure to property. We'll take a quick look at sort of the data that we include under rail. There is a whole host of rail information included within our data, what we recommend and what reports are available, what the report options are. So just starting with an overview of the London Underground. It is the oldest underground railway in the world. It opened in 1863. The Metropolitan Railway between Paddington and Farringdon was the first urban underground railway in the world. And this line is now part of the Circle, Hammersmith and City and Metropolitan lines and was the first line to operate underground electric traction trains. It took 21 years from 1863 to 1884 to complete the inner circle of tube lines in central London. The majority of the central London network was completed in its first 50 years through cut and cover tunnels along existing thoroughfares. So it wasn't until the turn of the 20th century in the introduction of electric traction that development turned deep underground lines. So even though everybody refers to the London Underground as the London Underground, actually a huge amount of it is above ground. The network has since expanded to 11 lines. The total length of the tube network is roughly about 249 miles. And the shortest distance between two stations is from Leicester Square to Covent Garden on the Piccadilly line, which is a mere 300 meters apart, which is quite hilarious because I have seen people take the tube for those 300 meters. In 2017, 2018, it was used by 1.35 billion passenger journeys. It makes it the world's 12th busiest metro system. And the 11 lines collectively handle up to 5 million passenger journeys a day. And the busiest tube station is actually Waterloo, which was used or is used roughly by about 95 million passengers in a year. So the fun, interesting fact is there's about 49 abandoned ghost stations along the network, like the one that you see here. This is the former underground station at Aldwych in London. And the station is actually quite a popular filming location. Several underground abandoned stations have been in films like V for Vendetta. You've got 28 Weeks Later. You've got Darkest Hour. So it's actually quite interesting and quite cool and an incredible amount of history. Now, living in close proximity to either an underground line, tram, or railway line can, of course, have possible negative effects on property in the form of operational noise and vibration, which we've touched on previously with any railway. Parliament has always recognized that railway operations can give rise to a degree of unavoidable noise and disturbance, and for this reason, you've got Section 122 of the Railways Act 1993, which provides network rail and train operators with statutory defenses to proceedings for nuisance. Ordinarily, this would cover claims alleging excessive noise or vibration, but this defense isn't unqualified. If the complaint refers to noise from railway premises, then the operator must demonstrate that they have used, I air quote here, reasonable diligence to control the noise or vibration if they are to claim the statutory immunity defense. And this applies, for example, to allegations of nuisance from, let's say, a platform loudspeaker or from a lift or plant room causing noise or vibration. Now, however, Even though there are negative effects associated with living in close proximity to the London Underground, analysis by Nationwide showed that residents actually were to pay a £42,000 approximate premium to live close to transport hubs. However, this study was done before COVID-19, which may have affected where people want to live as the need to commute to the office has reduced. In terms of noise pollution, up on the screen, we've put kind of what the noisiest ones are and where you get a lot of noise complaints. And as I mentioned earlier, the London Underground, even though it says underground, it's actually a huge amount of it is above ground. And these are the types of things that we want to be thinking about when we are buying properties in and around these types of infrastructure. Now, there are other underground lines in London, and some of them you may or may not have heard of. Now, by the turn of the 20th century, congested streets and fog meant that mail transported between the main post offices and railway stations in London was severely delayed. A department committee was set up in 1909 to study the use of underground pneumatic and electric railways. And in February of 1911, it recommended construction of an electric railway with driverless trains. And the recommendations were accepted. And in 1913, the Post Office Railway Bill was passed as an act. And the railway was to consist of 6.5 miles of tunnels at an average of 70 feet below ground. It would connect the west and east ends of London with 8 stations. Now, constructions of the tunnels began in 1914, and at the same time, a short experimental track complete with 1 car was erected on Plumstead Marshes. The tunneling work was completed in 1917. But the Treasury would not allow the post office to order or install the operating equipment during wartime, and the high price of materials after the war meant that work on the railway did not resume until 1923. And the railway was finally opened on the 5th of December 1927, with parcels traffic running between Mount Pleasant and Paddington. So the train runs in a single tunnel, is 9 foot in diameter with a double 2-foot gauge track. And at the station approaches, the main tunnels divide into 2 7-foot tunnels, each with a single track. Although the trains are much smaller than what's on, let's say, the London Underground, the stations actually look very much the same, with kind of the round walls that you will all be familiar with on the tube. And tunnels were actually used during the First World War to store and protect art treasures belonging to the National Portrait Gallery and the Tate Gallery. And the data is supplied. We do have this data and this information because actually it is really useful to know, tunneling infrastructure. And again, we covered this in the last session, but understanding where tunnels are near and proximity to a property is really important, no matter how old or historic they are. And we actually know to the full extent of these tunnels, the depths of the tunnels, and the depth to track level. So again, very, very important if you are buying property in and around these types of old infrastructures, but also if you have a client that's even looking at building or tunneling, going under their property, as we have seen before and previously, people within London are actually looking at getting planning permissions for basements and that type of thing. So if you are near old historic tunnels and you are close enough, you want to be aware of where these are. Now moving on to Crossrail. So we've put the map of Crossrail up on the screen for you. Crossrail is amongst the most significant infrastructure projects that have ever been undertaken in the UK. And its aim is to improve journey times across London to help ease congestion and to offer better connections. It will be known as the Elizabeth Line. You're looking at approximately 60 miles or over 100 kilometers from Reading and Heathrow in the west through 42 kilometers of new tunnels under London to Shenfield and Abbey Wood in the east. It is one of Europe's largest infrastructure projects, and it's an estimated that 200 million annual passengers will use Crossrail once it's fully operational. The Elizabeth Line will serve 41 stations, including 10 new stations, and you've got stations at like Paddington, Bond Street, Tottenham Court, et cetera, et cetera. And really, it's estimated to add £42 billion to the economy of the country. So in terms of property impacts, Research undertaken by property consultants GVA shows that the Elizabeth line is a major catalyst for regeneration all across London and the southeast. You're looking at, some of the studies show that it's allowing for accommodation of 300,000 new jobs in key employment hubs. And outside central London, town centres, including places like Ealing, Ilford, Romford, are being rejuvenated as the construction of new homes and offices attract more businesses and residents. You're also something like 90,000 new homes along the route are predicted, by 2026, possibly even more, possibly even double that. And Crossrail integrated the designs for 12 major property developments over and above the new Elizabeth line stations in London to create over 3 million square feet of various mixed use, office, retail, residential, and it generated over £500 million towards Crossrail's core funding package. So it's a significant it is definitely a significant project, and certainly one that, of course, people are saying is benefiting the whole country and economy. Now, the image that you see on your screen is actually at the Crossrail station at Canary Wharf. And the Crossrail project was initially due to be completed a few years ago, but we've all heard that there's been lots of delays and it's way over budget. With 825 million more government funding given in November of last year in the form of a loan. Its budget was set at 15.9 billion in 2007, but it's now expecting to cost around 18 billion pounds. So it's pretty significant. There's a lot of money that's been plunged into this. They are hoping it'll be operational by June of next year, and the project is currently in trial running, which involves the extensive commissioning of the railway before moving on to the trial operations phase. So it's basically like a dress rehearsal. There's going to be stuff that goes wrong, and that's what they're kind of working out in terms of the kinks. But yeah, again, hopefully, crossing all fingers, it's all going to be up and running June of next year. Having said that, there are, as I mentioned, funding issues, which we will need to keep an eye on. Now, another project that people had been talking about was actually Crossrail 2. Now, work on Crossrail 2 was officially paused as part of the emergency financial agreement between the government and TfL to fund the capital's transport network after passenger revenues dried up because of the pandemic. The costs for the development and design of the line, which was once hoped to be operational by the early 2030s, was shared between the Department of Transport and Transport for London. So a TfL spokesperson said that the pandemic and subsequent impact on our finances meant that we have had to be realistic about what is currently affordable. Now, a planned Bakerloo line extension for the underground is also on ice. So the line would have linked stations in the home counties to the north and southwest of the capital via new tunnels underneath central London, roughly along the route of the Chelsea-Hackney Underground line, which was first discussed in the 1970s. So central development funding was allotted from back in 2015-2016 when construction of the original Crossrail line appeared to be on time and on budget, and when Crossrail 2 was regarded as an essential part of the plan for handling HS2 passengers arriving in London Euston, a prospect that is in doubt. So the division within TfL that was working on Crossrail 2 was seconded to other work after COVID-19 hit last year. And TfL said that while the project was mothballed, land would remain safeguarded and the design work would remain relevant. So this is where you kind of want to keep that in your mind. We know the project's been put on ice, but the land has been safeguarded. And we'll talk about safeguarding a little bit further down, but that's kind of the relevant point, is that we want to make sure that people are aware of all the safeguarding areas, because if you are in or around those, then that's kind of significant to anyone looking at buying property. So how can London rail infrastructure impact properties? So from a practical perspective, we've discussed this already. What are people, what you would like to think people would be thinking about? The main concern really is how this is going to impact day-to-day living. things someone needs to consider when moving to a property in and around London. So primarily noise and pollution. Noise pollution impact, vibrational impact, how close are you to stations and tunnels? If your client is looking at altering their property or amending their property or applying for planning and they're close enough, that's something to be aware of. Can you hear it? Can you feel it? So a really good example of vibrations, particularly, I don't know if anybody remembers this, but back in 2013, the Beckhams had bought a very, very nice property in West London, only to find out that the Circle Line was actually right underneath their house and was close enough that it would shake and vibrate the kitchen, which is not ideal, particularly rush hour. Um, Even for me, from a practical perspective, when I first moved to the UK 15 years ago, my first flat was right next to the district line above ground. And it was basically going right past my bedroom window, close enough that people could wave. And I was not aware of this, let's just say, being a newbie. I was a new person to the city. I didn't realize how much it would actually shake the bedroom up. And I think the estate agent at the time that took me to show the rental property was very astute, because I think they knew which times it was quieter. And so actually, when I went to visit the property the first time, I didn't even realize that there were tube stations outside. Eventually, I got used to it, but lesson learned. So it's just understanding whether or not these types of infrastructure could potentially cause a nuisance. Now, it's likely that there will be some kind of uplift for properties in the vicinity of HS2 hubs and stations. However, it's so I mentioned HS2 and we talked about that last week. You've got phase 1 of HS2 that starts in London and comes out. However, it's unlikely that the effect would be so pronounced as, let's say, the 30 to 60% uplift reported around Crossrail stations, given that Crossrail is opening up easy commuting in the very heated London property market. So there is talk about HS2, the beginnings of HS2, who the passengers are actually going to be on HS2. Are they going to be residents or going to be leisure passengers? Research suggests it's actually going to be more tourists, which isn't ideal. So it's not just that, but also you think about Crossrail and the effect that that's had on the property market. We've had a whole slew of developers that are basically making a killing along the Crossrail line because they're buying plots of land in and around these Crossrail hubs. So that's also something to be aware of. There is likely to be some type of uplift, a modest uplift in property values, depending on how close you are to either tube stations or Crossrail stations or even HS2 stations in varying degrees. So it's just something, again, to be aware of. Some of the analysis we've done on the data, we can confirm that there are over 100,000 residential properties within 1 kilometer of, let's just say, the confirmed main HS2 hubs alone. And again, same with like the what do you call it? The Crossrail stations. There's a significant amount of properties that are going to be along there as well. So well worth thinking about. I talked about Crossrail and safeguarding. Now, safeguarding may impact your client depending on whether, where you are in terms of local authority. It depends on whether or not you're a developer. It depends on whether or not you're a land or property owner. Safeguarding does not mean that the property or a business you're looking at purchasing is definitely going to be affected by the new underground railway, but the safeguarding direction issued by the Department of Transport requires local planning authorities to consult people like TfL on planning applications within the boundaries shown on the safeguarding plans before granting planning approval. So as well as helping to protect the land needed to build and operate the railway, the safeguarding direction also triggers something known as statutory blight. And this means that the property owners and occupiers within the safeguarded area may be eligible to serve a blight notice, asking TfL to buy their property prior to it being needed for construction for the price it would be worth if Crossrail 2 wasn't being built. So if you're a property owner or a tenant with 3 or more years before your lease expires and are unsure whether or not your property falls within the safeguarded areas, We do suggest and strongly recommend to make sure that people are checking the safeguarding maps or are using the safeguarding property search. Again, we provide this information within our report, and you can see on the map on your screen that kind of shaded area is what we would it denotes like the safeguarding area. Now, the existing law associated with compensation and blight, unfortunately, is quite complex. There are specific criteria which have to be met for an individual to be eligible to receive compensation for statutory blight. So different rules apply to residential property, business premises, or agricultural interests, and we do advise you to seek professional advice if you're considering submitting a blight notice. I believe RICS offers a free consultation service for something like this. Now, statutory blight does not apply to properties outside the safeguarded area. So if you or your client have any concerns about how a property might be affected, then we do recommend speaking to people like the Crossrail safeguarding team. And we can provide you that guidance and information as well. So looking at the data. So this is the route. The orange that you see on the screen is the route of Crossrail 1, which I mentioned earlier, links Reading to Brentford, which will hopefully open up next year. And this data is, of course, included within our reports. That purple line, is the proposed route for Crossrail 2. And so now you see both. And really, when you think about Crossrail 2, again, think of that purple as being a safeguarding area. And we are keeping that information in our reports because at this point, it can still happen. And then the data that's come up on the screen now, this is the underground map and Crossrail 1. So this will be the full network of the London Underground along with Crossrail 1. And this is all included within our reports. You'll get all of this information depending on how close you are, how close your client's property is to the actual railways themselves. So here's an excerpt of what you would get within our reports. You get full route and operational times. These are included for the London Underground as well as the DLR, alongside our proprietary model depth data. You've got stations and proposed tube extensions are included. You get operational times. Of course, we've got the 24-hour lines within London now as well, so always good to know about that and what's included. Also talking about rail, all types of railway infrastructure, not just the London Underground, historic railways, abandoned railways, lines, tunnels, all of that's included as well within this data set. So yes, we're talking about London, but we are talking about every type of railway infrastructure in London, along with tunnels, line stations, in relation to the property boundary. So you're always going to get a map, you're always going to get a key and a legend to explain to you what it is and how close it is and whether it's a historical tunnel or a current active tunnel, just like you see on the map. You will also then see, so in terms of things like Crossrail and HS2, you will know if you are within a safeguarding area and if there's any stations or work sites, any type of kind of compensation information, how close you are to the track, the speed at which the track is running, construction timetables and local stations, all of that is included as well. So it's a pretty comprehensive set of information, but certainly one that will be useful for people to know and understand in and around London. And as always, I've mentioned this before, if you have any questions regarding this, you can always pick up the phone and speak to us. We're more than happy to help you. You can also get your client to pick up the phone and speak to us, and we'll be more than happy to help guide them around the information. So in terms of recommendations, I think you'd like to think it's fairly common sense, but in terms of recommendations, really some practical advice that you can give clients. If you have clients and it's maybe the first time they're moving to London or moving to an area they're unfamiliar with, we always advise people, particularly in the London area near underground stations and railway stations, go visit the property at different times of the day, different times of night, so you really get an understanding of how close and what the impact is from noise. Particularly if you're very close to the to central London and in and around tube stations, things like structural surveys, check to see if they've considered the vibration from the trains. That's always something that we always recommend is useful. And just make sure that, clients are aware of what's happening with abandoned and historic railways. That stuff can always be reopened, whether there be active railways or not, or there'll be tourist type things like the postal tunnels. That's a big tourist attraction. How is that going to impact you from a day-to-day life? And again, same thing with things like Crossrail II and the safeguarding areas. So these are all very practical things to just keep in mind and remember, and just to remind your client. And again, all these guidance and practical guidance and next steps are outlined in any report that you get from us, which includes energy and transportation information. So in terms of report options, you would have heard me talk about the Groundsure Vista. So that covers all of the things that you see on the screen. HS2, Crossrail, other railways, London Underground, DLR, all of that's included in the Avista as standard. It's also the same with the home buyers. That's included. Energy and transportation included as well. If you happen to already have, let's say, an Enviro and you don't want a combined product, then you can buy an energy and transportation report as a separate standalone item or a standalone report that is also available. So do speak to your account manager and your search provider to understand what your options are. And in some cases, we have clients who basically, if they are within the greater London area, they want that information included right from the get-go. So you do have options where it's a combined enviro and energy and transportation. So they're all there, the options are there for you, and they should be fairly easy to understand. And that is pretty much it, a nice and short session today. If you've got any questions, please feel free to reach out. We have a recording, we have a copy of the slides, and there'll be a feedback survey launching after this. So thanks very much and have a great rest of your day.